Okay, so let's dive into some effects. Two ways to do this, actually three ways to do this on the machine. One would be to use the internal effects, which is the simplest and easiest way because everything exists in the box already. And it's as simple as taking a track or an input and a send from that track or input, whatever channel you want, to an internal effects processor and take a return from that effects processor and mix it with all the other audio. The second way is to use external hardware devices like a rack mount reverb unit or a rack mount multi-effects processor. Works pretty much the same way, except you take an auxiliary send instead of an effects send that to the external device using either digital in and out or analog in and out, return that effects device to any of the available inputs, and mix that audio with the existing audio. The third way, which is really kind of my favorite way to do all of this, is to send from any of the tracks using ADAT to a computer running effects plugins. Any effects plugins, basically. Any effects plugins your computer can host can work as effects for the DPS24. The first way we're going to do it on the video here is to use the internal effects because it's the easiest and simplest way to do it. Now again, Dan did these really nice harmony parts on the guitar, and because they're so dramatic and so separate in the mix, I'm going to use those as our example for internal effects. So I'm going to go to one of Dan's guitar melodies, and we have those on tracks 13 and 14. So I'm going to press the Q channel button. Okay, go to tracks 13 through 24 fader bank, and I'm going to hit track 13. Now I noticed that I didn't link these two, and because of the nature of this melody, I'm going to link them as a stereo pair. So whatever I do to one will automatically be done to the other. Now, in addition to effects at this point, if I wanted to make corrective EQ adjustments or EQ adjustments to enhance those tracks, this is when I would most prefer to do it rather than on the inputs. However, the screen that you see here, this channel screen, is the exact same screen you see on the inputs, so anything I tell you here applies there as well. One thing I like to do, especially on an instrument like guitar, is I like to get rid of any low frequency audio that I may not need that'll only add garbage and junk to the mix. So what I can do is I can use Q5 to scroll around the screen, and I'm going to go to the low frequency band, and I'm going to set it at 60 Hertz or somewhere around there. Now because this band has a gradual slope to it, or Q, I'm going to set it to 60 Hertz, and then I'm going to use Q6 to decrease my gain at that band. And you'll notice it's a very gradual slope, so that's why I went so low, 60 Hertz, before I did the subtractive EQ, because I don't want to mess up the guitar that exists in the mid-range band. The other way I can do this, by the way, is obviously, as with all things, there's a lot of ways to do it on the machine. I can hit the minus button on the numeric keypad, and or the plus button, and I can watch my EQ curve change. And the other thing I can do is I can use Axis while it's active on the computer to enter this information too. By the way, each band on the EQ gives you plus or minus 24 dB. It's a pretty big, hefty cut. Because this curve is so gradual, I can also redraw this curve a little bit at the mid-range by complementing it with what I do on the mid-range, the mid-frequency band on the EQ. And I'm going to start boosting that, okay, to sharpen up the curve of the low-frequency cut. And do something like that. You'll notice I have a lot steeper curve happening now, so it's sort of acting like a high pass filter now on those tracks. which will help get rid of any mud, any low frequency content from a really twangy kind of a mid-range guitar we don't really need anyway. And it'll step on the bass track. That's EQ. Dynamics, if I press the F3 button, I get to the Dynamics page, and again, this is the same for any channel on the mixer, or input or track channel. I have compressor, I have as well as an expander. By using Q1 I can set compression or expansion. I also have a noise gate, all available. And on all of these settings, from EQ to compression and gating, I have a library where you can set up and store your own presets for dynamics or EQ, as well as recall factory presets that came with the machine, which is a pretty handy thing for getting around your projects quick. Like for instance, on EQ, I do a lot of this semi-high pass filter stuff. It would be handy for me to save a EQ preset in my library here, and all I would have to do is I press F6, the library button, okay, and I want to store that EQ, and now I can name it. Again, using Access is a little faster, so I'm going to call this Guitar High Pass Filter. Okay, hit OK, and now whenever I want to use that EQ curve, no matter what I do, if I do flat EQ here, that gets rid of it. I press the library, and now all I got to do is find my Guitar High Pass Filter, which is now listed in the library, and hit recall, and there's my curve. I saved myself a lot of time. You can do that with dynamics and EQ, and really helps. So now I've applied some EQ, and if I wanted to, I could apply some compression. I already compressed these tracks when we recorded them, but the internal compressors are really good, by the way. They're really clean and accurate. They don't have a lot of heavy character, but I don't think you really want that anyway most of the time. The next thing I want to do is I want to take Dan's guitar harmonies and add some effects to it. On this part of the screen, I have 4 virtual knobs that are my sends, okay? And again, when I use Q5, I can scroll around the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll to number 1, which is set on global, which is where you normally want to leave it in most cases. This could also be set on aux, okay? I'm leaving it set on global. I'm going to scroll down. I could set it post or pre-fader. I can take my send before or after the track fader. If I took it before the track fader, that send's value will remain the same, and it will be dependent on how hot I recorded the tracks. No matter what I do with this track fader, if I automate that track and I have the fader moving around and the audio from the track is getting louder or softer, my send will remain constant. There's a common effect where if you're sending to a reverb unit and you want it to sound like someone's walking into a tunnel, the audio drops, but the reverb stays the same volume. And the way you would do that, you would take a pre-fader send, so that as you drop the audio fader, the reverb is staying the same level, and it would sound like the source was getting further and further away from you. If I take it post-fader, the reverb send will mirror the fader position. As I raise or lower the fader, my send to the effects gets lower or louder. I'm going to take a post-fader send, okay, and now I'm going to go down and I get to my virtual knob, which right now is set on minus 120 dB, which is the equivalent of off. And if I want to send, just to set this up enough so that I can hear it, I'm going to set that to 0. So once again, I can use the numeric keypad, I can use Q6, however you want to do it. If I use the numeric keypad, I highlight it, type in a value, and hit enter. And there's my send. At 0.0, my send is equal to unity. And that means my send is the same as my track level, in theory. So now I'm taking track 13, which is linked to 14. So tracks 13 and 14, okay, have the same EQ and have the same send. And I'm going to send those to FX device number 1, which is my internal effects number 1. The next thing I need to do is I need to see what FX number 1 is. So I hit the FX screen, and I have a screen dedicated to effects. On the left-hand side of the screen, I have my 4 effects processors listed. Effects processor 1, or channel 1, 2, 3, and 4. Each one is showing us the current setting. Effects channel 1 is set for a studio reverb. If I want to change that, I cursor to the right, scroll through my choices, let's use a, well, for demonstration purposes, let's use a big hall, because you'll really be able to hear that. Highlight it, hit recall, and now FX channel 1 says big hall. And here's all the adjustments I can make for this reverb. I can adjust the pre-delay, the reverb time, the diffusion of it, high frequency dampening, width of it, and near field, which is like a mix control. In order to hear what I'm doing, okay, the only thing I need to do now, because I'm sending from the tracks to the reverb unit, is to raise the effects fader. So I go to the group FX fader bank, and in this fader bank, faders 1 through 8 are for the 8 internal groups, and we'll get into groups in a little while. Faders 9 through 12 are the effects returns for internal effects channels 1 through 4. So what I would do is start off with all of this in the 0 position, actually, because we're not using any groups in this. And if I want to hear effects 1, which in this fader bank is fader 9, all I have to do is raise that while the track is rolling. So okay, now I can do all kinds of things with that. As I said, I can adjust that here. I can increase my pre-delay. I can shorten the time of the reverb. And increase the diffusion. And let's try this. Okay? The other thing I can do with this is I can actually send these effects back to an input channel. And as I said earlier, I can EQ the effect, I can compress that effect, I can add a gate to it to create gated reverb effects. Although there is a gate algorithm in here. There's all kinds of things you can do with these effects because they're all internal to the machine. There are no latency issues, there are really no patching concerns or anything like that. It's all internal. That's basically how you set the effects. You take a send, pre-fader, or post-fader from a channel, whether it's an input, because you can use it on an input channel and record the effects, or I take those sends from a disc track, set it up the way I want it, choose the effect that I want, and raise the appropriate effect return fader, and there I go. Because by default, all the effects are routed to the left-right master, or assigned to the left-right master. So when I raise that effect fader, the effects audio is going to come back into the mix with everything else we're hearing. And as well, if I wanted to, I can have effects chained. I can take one effect and send it to another effect. For instance, I could take a delay algorithm, use that to process a track, and send that to a reverb. Or I can send a chorus to a reverb to create a real swishy kind of a thing. There's all kinds of stuff you can do with the internal effects. The process remains the same. The next thing we can do is we can hook up to an external hardware device. I don't have one here anymore, but basically what you would do is you go back to the channel screen, and instead of using an FX send, okay, you would set this as an auxiliary send. And using Q5 to scroll to it, I would highlight it, and I would set this to auxiliary 1. This will take this track, post fader, and send it out the back of the machine to an auxiliary output. Now, you would take a regular patch cable, a regular analog patch cable, patch that auxiliary output to the input of your hardware or your rack mount effects device, do your processing the same way you would as if it was internal, and take the output of the external effect device and hook it up to any available input on the machine. From there it can get routed to the left-right master the same way the internal effects would be routed to the left-right master. The third way that we can use effects with the DPS24 has to do with ADAT and running plug-in effects, software effects, on that same computer that uses the USB connection to run Access can simultaneously use an ADAT connection between the DPS24 and the computer to run plug-in effects hosted on the computer in real time. Because I have a dual monitor set up on this computer, I can leave Access open on one screen for a second. I'm going to minimize it. And I'm going to open an application called Console Modular Studio. And what Console is a very simple application that works like a giant effects rack. It allows you to connect to the computer by ADAT, and it hosts plug-in effects. That's all it does. It doesn't record audio. It doesn't allow editing or anything like that. It actually comes with a simple sequencer, by the way. And who knows, maybe Art Technica, the developer, is going to expand that functionality. But for right now, it's a very simple application that hosts both VST and DX plugins for effects, as well as DXI and VSTI instruments. So in other words, you could have soft synths in Console, open them up, connect to the computer by MIDI from a keyboard, and record those soft synths into the DPS24. I don't do that, but that's another way to use Console. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take tracks, send their audio to Console, and run the plug-in effects. The DPS24 comes with 8 channels standard of ADAT in and out, which allows me to run any combination of stereo or mono in and out from between the DPS24 and the computer. I also have the ADAT expansion card in the DPS24, which gives me a full 24 channels of ADAT in and out. What I could do is I could take my auxiliary sends and set those up as ADATs, but that would only give me 4 sends. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the tracks directly using ADAT, and because I have 24 channels of ADAT available, I can take any or all of the tracks I want, send them into Console in real time, process those with effects, and apply any kind of processing that I want in Console and bring it back in. So once Access is open, all I have to do is pick a track, to give you an example of how I would do this, and send that to ADAT. On the DPS24, I would go to the patch screen, and the patch screen is the shift function of the mixer screen. So I hold Shift, Mixer, and I get to the patch screen. As with EQ and dynamics in the DPS24, you can set up and save your own patch presets. Another really handy function. Now, on the first screen, you see input channel sources. By default, input channel 1 gets its audio from analog to digital converter number 1. But I can set that to be anything I want. I scroll around the screen and highlight whatever I want to change with Q5. I change the value with Q6. So if I look through the choices, input channel 1 can get its audio from any ADAT, any analog to digital converter, from an auxiliary in, from the 2-track in, any ADAT in, up to 24 channels in my case, effects, or the metronome can all be sourced as input channel sources. This is the same type of deal you can do on the input channel screen. So the DPS24 gives you another place to make the source audio assignment for any channel. I'm going to set this back at its default setting where input channel 1 gets its audio from analog to digital converter 1, or ADC number 1. You also have disc record sources on the same screen, and again, you get around the screen by cursoring, or you can use Q5 to scroll around the screen. You highlight a disc record source for disc record 1, which will be disc channel 1. Scroll through the sources. Again, you can get your source audio from anywhere. ADATs, effects, metronome, auxiliaries, ADCs direct, groups, inputs, okay? And again, this is the same as you would see on the channel screen for the disc tracks. Second screen is outputs. You have the same functionality. You can scroll around using Q5, and output aux assigned by default. Auxiliary 1 gets its audio from auxiliary send 1, but it doesn't have to be, because you can change that to be anything you want. What I've done is I've set up a patch preset called Frankenstein. I scroll down, highlight Frankenstein, press F6, select, and what this gives me, on my input channel sources, I have, for input channels 1 through 12, I have ADAT 1 through 12. That means that 12 ADAT channels coming into the inputs are available as input channel sources. I only use this when I'm mixing because all my recording of tracks is done. When I go to the output screen, you'll notice that for track 1, okay, I've got ADAT output assigns. Track 1 is going out ADAT 1. Track 2 is going out ADAT 2. All the way to track 24, which is going out ADAT 24. What this means is that in this patch preset, all my 24 possible tracks are assigned to go out 24 channels, corresponding channels of ADAT. Taking a track directly this way doesn't change the audio of the track. You're hearing the audio the same as you would if it weren't being sent, but it's also sending that track out digitally through ADAT into the computer where console receives the audio. I have a 24 channel ADAT PCI sound card in my computer also that's already been installed and configured. And when I open up console, I can now route any of those 24 tracks that are going out 24 ADAT channels to any input on console. The first thing I do in console, once I open up the screen, okay, is I hit the play button to activate it. What that does is it makes it live, is basically what it does. Next, I hit the function button and I highlight and drag my wave in, which are my inputs, and my wave out, which are my outputs. In other words, outputs back to the DPS24. Inputs is audio that's coming in. And bring those into the work surface. I click and hit the speaker icon on the output side, and I get myself a nice meter setup. I now have meters that show me the levels of all the audio leaving console before it comes back to the DPS24. As well as I have faders for all the channels that I can click on and drag. I can also link any amount of faders if I want. And once they're linked, if I touch one, I move them all. The next thing I do is I hit plugs. Now I'm going to pick a reverb plugin, one that I like a lot. I can take any of the Anwitasoft stuff. I'm going to take Anwitasoft Spazio. which is a DX plugin listed under the DX header. Clicking once, drag it into the work surface. Okay, I can do that as many times as I want. I can take out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can run as many effects processors simultaneously, or as many instances of a single processor simultaneously as the power of my computer will allow. In reality, and this is only a fairly powerful computer, I can run way more effects simultaneously than I would ever want to on a project. Once I've got the effects I want out in the workspace, I'm going to get rid of some of these. Okay. For this demonstration, I'm only going to use one plugin and show you how it works. Using those same harmony parts that Dan did, I'm going to send to an external reverb plugin as opposed to the internal reverb being hosted in console. Dan's guitar parts that I want to use are on tracks 13 and 14. Keeping in mind that I have all my ADAT channels configured to mirror the track channels on the DPS24, I'm going to use ADAT inputs 13 and 14. I'm going to connect from those, draw a line to the input of the Instructional reverb. Instructional is a stereo in, stereo out reverb, Spazio. So I could take 13 and draw a line and hit both sides of Spazio. Or I could take 13 and just run it to the left side, and 14 and run it to the right side, and preserve the stereo image that exists on those tracks as it is. I'm going to take Spazio's output and connect that to ADAT out of the computer, which will be coming in 1 on the DPS24 and 2. I'm sending one signal of audio to the left input of the Spazio reverb, one signal of audio, a different signal, sending it to the right input. I'm going to process it with reverb, send them out to the DPS24. Okay? As well as, in the console work surface, I can click and drag and change the level. In this case, it would be the input level to Spazio, because it's on the left side. The workflow is from left to right on console. I can also click and drag the output and decrease the output level from Spazio, as well as the fact, since I'm connected to 1 and 2, I can take my 1 and 2 faders and raise or lower them, or link them and raise or lower them as a pair. So this is the same as plugging in hard wires, except it's all done in computer time, so you don't have to plug in wires. You don't have patch cords that could be noisy, or a patch bay. As I said before, if I did have another set of another instance of Spazio on my workspace, I could take those same tracks and simultaneously send them to a different instance of Spazio. You can draw as many lines as you want in any configuration you want. Set this Spazio up one way, set this one up another way. I can return them to the same 2 outputs going back to the DPS24, or I can return them to their own separate outputs going back to the DPS24, or I can take one reverb and easily set up an effects chain where I'm sending the output of one reverb to the input of the next reverb. And of course, this doesn't have to be a reverb. I could send a chorus plugin to a reverb plugin. I could send a compressor plugin, and there are some great ones, to a reverb plugin. I can do an EQ plugin to a compressor to a reverb to a... You can chain as many in a row as you want, 5, 6, 7 plugins. It gets crazy. But I'm just going to do one for now to give you the idea of how this all works. the next thing I want to do is I'm going to look at Spazio, how it's set up. I'm going to take a nice Hall reverb, and I'm going to set my mix control at 100%. I don't want any dry signal in here because I've already got the dry signal on the tracks. I'm going to set my pre-delay long, around 200 milliseconds. This decay is pretty long. I'm going to shorten that up to about 2 seconds, 2,000 milliseconds. And I'll leave the rest of it the way it is. Okay. Now I should be able to hear the audio. Now the reason why we're hearing it right away is because I'm coming back in through ADAT channels 1 and 2 to inputs 1 and 2, which are assigned to the left-right master so I can hear them. If I want to change my mix, my reverb mix, all I have to do is work input channels 1 and 2. Okay? So that's happening. Good tracks, Dan. Okay? Sky's the limit. You can do anything you want with this stuff. And it's crazy. It's easy to overdo it, as a matter of fact. That's basically how Spazio, how plugin effects work in Console Modular Studio in conjunction with the DPS24 in real time. When we go to set up a mix, I can do all my effects processing here, as well as when I'm done, if I'm not done mixing in one session, I can hit File, Save As, and save this as demo. Now when I go the next time to open a session, I have all my console settings saved from my previous work, and all I got to do is open up that session of console, open up the DPS24, and I'm right back where I was. Everything was saved. I haven't lost anything. I can add more effects, I can take away effects, and then I can close this again, resave it, and I've now got an updated session of console with all the work I've done since the last time I opened it. Everything is compartmentalized. When you go to archive the project, you can save your multi-track, you can save your mix of the project, and you can save your console effects for the project, all in a nice, neat folder on your computer. And if you ever should want a year from now to remix this thing, you can open up the whole thing and everything's good to go. That's basically how we do computer plug-in effects real time with the DPS24 console, a computer, and ADAT. We've covered tracking, we've covered levels, sources, effects, editing, a little bit on DSP. I want to show you how we do a little bit of automation on this track. I'm going to automate the clavinet track. So what I did was I located an in point right at the end of the song where the clavinet comes back in again. Instead of having it come in sharp, I'm going to have it fade in. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to automate the track faders, the track fader for the clavinet part. Because I put an in point there, I can go back to it anytime I want. Okay, and start doing an automation pass right on that place right there. Before I touch any automation on the machine, I'm going to go to, let me close this out. I'm going to go to the beginning of the song, and I'm going to store scene 00. This is really important. This whole concept of scene 00 for automation is really an important thing to get a grasp on. For the machine to make changes in real time using automation, it needs to start somewhere. All your other automation passes are relative to the very beginning of the song where everything started. You need a starting level, starting pans, starting effect sends, and that's all stored as scene 00. Since I've got my mix happening basically the way I like it, I'm going to go to 00 on the song, or the start point of the song. I'm going to go to the machine, mix scene. I'm going to press store. I get a screen here where I can have all these different scenes stored. 00 is highlighted, okay, scene store, and I'm going to hit store. I get another screen that says store all controls. This scene holds the initial control values for your automation, which is what I just explained to you. Continue, okay. Now, no matter what I do on the machine, I can always get back to this starting point. Because, for instance, say I take all my tracks and move them around. Okay, my inputs, move them around. Groups, effects, move them around. My mix is still safe because all I have to do to recall my starting point, which was scene 00, is hit mix scene recall, initial scene, recall, and everything is back to where it was. Okay? Now that I've saved scene 00 and I've tested it and made sure everything works properly, I'm going to actually automate 2 tracks. 1 track, which is the clavinet track. The same process will apply no matter how many tracks you want to automate. I'm going to go to my endpoint, which is where I want to start the automation. Okay? And I'm going to call up the automate screen on the DPS24. And again, this has its own dedicated button on this lovely, generous control surface. Okay? And I get a screen here where we have a graphic that shows us what channels are safe. Okay? In other words, to prevent you from automating a channel you don't want to, you can make any or all of the channels record safe. Okay? As well as we can do things like turn the fader motors on and off. You can still record automation, but the fader motors won't be moving around. Automation can be on or off. In this case, we want it on. I can set what type of events I want to record. I can record all events. I can record fader movements, pan movements, channel on and off, which would be mutes, FX and auxiliary sends, or all. In all mode, I can record all of those things during a single pass. I can set the record mode. I can have it off, in which case the machine is again safe because I can't record in the automation. I can have it in auto drop. In auto drop mode, because these faders are touch sensitive, as well as being long throw 100mm faders, so that they have good resolution. Because they're touch sensitive, in auto drop mode, any fader I touch will automatically record automation data. In overwrite mode, I have to actually select what channels I'm going to record to, and it'll overwrite the automation in any channel during a record pass. Okay, I'm going to leave it in auto drop. Dropout mode is stop. Okay, return to end, stop. That tells you where it stops recording automation. Normally, for most cases, the stop, the default setting, is the simplest to use, because what that means is as soon as you stop the transport after an automation pass, it drops automatically out of record mode. I'm automating the clavinet, which is track 12, so I'm going to go to the tracks 1 through 12 fader bank. This is the fader I'm going to automate. Okay? And I'm going to let the track run. You don't have to press record. You just let the track run, grab the fader, and make the move. I'm going to make a gross move just to show you how this works, even though that's not what I want for the track. check it back up to before where I started the automation. Okay, I could have grabbed the pan pot, I could have changed the pan position, it would have worked the exact same way. As well as anything on the machine that's controlled by the pan pots and or the faders can be automated. For instance, if I go to the effects bank, group effects bank, I can automate an effect so I can have the effect fade in. I can automate my groups. I can automate inputs. In this case, that would be important because I've got my plug-in effects coming back into the DPS24 into input channels. So I can actually fade the inputs in to the mix, automate that. I can mute the any of the channels, the input channels, track channels, turn them on and off in real time. And again, while the transport's running, all I do is hit the mute, or the on, which in this case would be the on button, where I want it to come on, hit it again where I want it to go off. And all the data is recorded in real time. Some people have trouble making accurate moves with faders. The DPS24 provides for those people too. If you like to input your data visually in a graphic way, there's something called trim faders on the DPS24. And instead of real-time grabbing a fader, what that allows us to do is to input data from a specific point onwards. For instance, if I get to, let's see, we'll use the, let's use that same clavinet track, okay? I'm going to get to a point in that track where I want it to back off a little bit. Okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to have the clavinet duck underneath that little guitar figure that we just passed. I'm looking at the guitar figure on the screen. I can see it. I'm going to set an in point there. I'm going to go after it. I'm going to set an out point. Again, I've defined a region. I'm going to press the Trim Faders button. Oh, automation must be on. And record mode set to off. Okay? The Trim Faders screen, okay, when you first get into it, is a blank screen. In the upper right hand corner, we use Q1 to set the trim region. I'm going to set it to in, out. What that means is whatever tracks I automate using trim faders will only automate within a specific region. Since the DPS24 can define regions to the sample level, you can automate precisely a specific region. Whether you need to do that or not, whether you can hear that kind of a change or not is up to you. But this allows you to do this kind of precise automation. Since I want to duck the clavinet behind that guitar figure, and I define that region where the figure is with an in and out point, and I set my trim region as the in and out point, all I have to do now is grab the clavinet fader, which is fader 12. So I go to tracks 1 through 12, fader bank. I grab it, and since it's a touch sensitive fader, automatically on the screen we get a disc channel 12 fader input. And if I raise or lower that fader, I now have a trim for that fader, for that in and out region of either plus or minus the existing level at that point. Trim faders works on the existing level, so I'm subtracting or adding to the level at that region. I want to make it duck, so I'm going to do a big duck. I'm going to do a 4.5 dB duck under that guitar figure just for that in and out region. 4.5 dB is enough to let you see the fader move. So I'm going to press trim. The screen allows you to trim visually at one shot up to 16 faders. You can trim the entire song as well. If you get to mix time and you find yourself peaking, a cheap way out is to just trim faders for the entire song, all the tracks. and set your in and out region as the entire saw. So now I'm going to leave this screen. I'm going to go back, look at that region, and see if I can see my fader duct below the guitar melody. Okay? So trim faders allows you to do real precise automation moves that you might not be able to do manually accurately, and go back as many times as you want. As well, on the automate page, you can clear automation from as many tracks as you want, dynamic automation, okay? And you can actually look at your events on here. You can automate scenes, and you can automate snapshots. Scenes don't really work particularly well in most cases because a scene is a global change. So it's, in other words, you're changing the entire mix setting. It may take a second to have a scene automation recall. So you have to plan ahead of time. You have to kind of feel where that scene change needs to be inserted for it to happen where you want it to. I personally tend to use scenes as alternate mixes. If I want to hear one mix, I'll recall scene 00, which would be my main. If I want to set up a separate mix and see if I like that better, I'll save that all to scene 01 and turn off automation, and I can just hear those two mixes just by pressing the scene recall button. Snapshots, which is channel automation, can be recalled in real time too, and they work faster and better because it's less data. It's less of a global change happening on the machine. That's basically what I've got so far in my mix. I've got it automated, I've got it edited, I've got effects added. The next thing we need to go over is how to actually burn a mix on a DPS24, and I'll show you how to do that.